Hi, let's talk about dependency injection in .NET. First, what is dependency injection really? It is a design pattern as it influences how you write your code, particularly by encouraging heavy use of interfaces and making you think about a class's responsibilities and its dependencies. It is also one of a few techniques that enable what's called inversion of control, which simply means that instead of a class creating its own dependencies, they are created somewhere else and given to the class. In the case of a dependency injection, we say that the so-called service provider is responsible for creating and giving out all dependencies. Dependency injection is incredibly common in .NET and is used in almost every official and most community-maintained libraries, especially so in .NET Core, which makes it even easier to use. Now, let's show an example of code without dependency injection that will demonstrate why we would want to use it. It's a fairly contrived example, but it should get the point across. We will then later add dependency injection so you can see how it is done. So this is a very simple console application that will demonstrate why we would want to use dependency injection. We have three main classes here I want to talk about. First, we have a model class called person, which represents a person, in this case, some abstraction of me. We then also have a serializer, which is responsible for serializing incoming objects. In this case, this would be system text contrived JSON serializer. It looks something like this. We then also have a JSON console outputter. In this case, this takes in an object and then uses its internal JSON serializer to serialize that object and then outputs it. It looks something like this. And obviously, it doesn't do the serialization itself because we want to keep that separated. The concern should be separate and be kept in its own class. So if we run this, it will look something like this. So we get the same object printed 5 times. So this is obviously a very simple application, but you can quickly see that if this were to grow, then keeping track of all the dependencies out here in main would quickly get kind of bloated. The alternative is not much better. Like we could comment this out, remove that, go in here, and just say that instead of injecting this, we just set it up ourselves, right? We can just create new system text JSON. We could do something like this. But then now these classes are hard coupled. In fact, they were already fairly hard coupled, but now they're really hard coupled in that when you construct this one, you also construct this one. So let's revert these changes as they're just worse, right? We want to have something like this. And in fact, we could then switch to using the interfaces here to make it a little bit better. But we can switch an interface here too, actually. Still, we do have a problem, and that is that when we instantiate, we can't use an interface, right? So we have to somewhere we need to use a concrete type. For example, here. So now with the interfaces, we can run this again, and it should still work. Yeah. So I think it's time that we apply dependency injection to this project to see how it changes. So first, we need to add some libraries. So let's open up the NuGet package manager. Let's install Microsoft Extensions Dependency Injection. That's done. So now we can go back here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set up a service collection. It's very common to call this services. So we'll just say new service collection. And to this collection, we will then add everything we need the dependency injector to know about, which would be everything, any class that we want to be able to pull out of the service provider, but also all the dependencies for those classes. So in this case, that would be the outputter and the JSON serializer. So let's add those. So we'll do services.add, and now there's 3 add methods. There's singleton, scoped, and transient. Let's use singleton for now, and I will go more into detail what these are later. So we'll add singleton. I want to add a system text JSON contrived serializer. And then I'll just copy this and change this to be a JSON console outputter. And then finally, we need to build the actual service provider. So we'll do var service provider equals services dot build service provider. And then we can actually remove the top one, and the outputter we could change to be service provider dot get required service, and then JSON console outputter. So we do need one more thing before we can fix, since the constructor for JSON console outputter actually expects an interface and not a concrete class. We need to register this class with that interface, and that's very easy to do. You just add a space in front of here, and we can just throw in contrive JSON serializer, comma, so interface, comma, and then the actual concrete implementation. So if we run this now, it still works, right? But we're now using dependency injection with only these lines of code here. We should probably add an outputter here as well. So let's outputter, boom, and then we can change this to an outputter as well. So now we're very loosely coupled and lovely. So what were the other available methods on services? Well, right now we only use singleton. So let's introduce a new class. I'm going to include in my project a file that I made before. This is the counting console outputter. It is an outputter just like the other ones. However, this one actually has its own state, right? It has a counter that increases every time you print something, and it will tell you how many times it has printed. So let's register one of those, but let's register it as singleton, as transient. I mean. So let's register an outputter for counting console outputter. Now, you can have more than one class assigned to the same interface, but in this case, we're just going to uncomment this one because we don't want to use this one anymore. Well, now that we have this should still work, and it will give us roughly the same, except it will tell you that it has printed 5 times. Yep, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Great. That's because what transient does is that every time you get this service out of the service provider, you will get a new instance. So since we're only getting it once with this statement here, we're still only getting one. But if we instead duplicate this and say, outputter 2, and then we can duplicate this loop, and I'll say outputter 2. If we then run this now, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they are 2 different instances of the same class. While if we change this back now to add singleton, and we run it again, you'll see that it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because outputter and outputter 2 are actually pointing to the same instance. So this is the main difference between singleton and transient, in that singleton always returns the same instance, transient always returns a new instance. Scoped is some kind of in between where you can create like local application scopes, and within that scope it's always the same. For example, a really common use case for this is in a web application where you will have a request scope. So whenever you get an incoming request, within the resolution of that request, it will be the same scope. But once we have returned a response to the caller, then and a new request comes in, then it will be a new scope. It's really good for keeping track of, for example, in case you want to track every single API call you make, or like being able to refer to, hey, who is requesting this object, right?